Let's get to our panel right now. Joining us for more from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution. In our Washington, D.C. studio, Sourabh Gupta is a resident senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Just across town from us in New York, Robert Hormats is vice chairman of Kissinger Associates and a former U.S. Undersecretary of State. And with me right here in the UN Rose Garden is Chief Political Correspondent for CCTV America, Wang Guan. He's been covering the UN General Assembly this week. Well, welcome to all of you. Qinduo, let me start with you in Beijing. State Councilor Wang Yi made a wide-ranging speech to the United Nations General Assembly covering a whole range of hot-button issues. He devoted a considerable amount of time in that speech to the particular issue of multilateralism. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
State-to-state relations must be based on credibility, not willful revocation of commitments. International cooperation should be guided by rules, not impulse. Practicing multilateralism is first and foremost about upholding the UN Charter, observing international law and basic norms governing international relations, and honoring international agreements reached through negotiations. Multilateralism is not about making empty rhetoric. It must be pursued to solve problems. Efforts must be targeted, results-oriented, and measured by visible progress.
So, Qinduo Xu, what was your main takeaway from this address?
Well, it's noticeable that the foreign minister stressed the importance of credibility. I think it referred to China-U.S. trade negotiation, at least for a couple of times, when both teams from China and the United States thought they reached a deal, but only rejected later by the administration in the U.S. And of course, in the latest cases, well, both sides were ready to start the negotiation, and then there's $200 billion of basic goods on tariff on Chinese export to the United States. So as a senior Chinese official says, how can you start talks when the U.S. holds a knife basically on your throat? So it's a very difficult situation. So the Chinese side, one of the major complaints is a credibility issue, which a senior official we can talk to who might have this authority or given or authorized by President Trump. So this is very puzzling for the Chinese side.
Wang Guan, we heard from the State Councilor here telling us that multilateralism is what works. Unilateralism is not something that works. In the speech he also talked about mutually beneficial development policies. He talked about the search for peace. In fact, one of the terms he used, and he's used this term very often, but one of the terms he used in this particular speech, and he used it several times, was we are searching for win-win solutions. That's something of a guiding principle for China, isn't it?
Exactly, Anand. We heard from the State Councilor. He's basically rejecting the trade protectionism. He's saying that look, if a Chinese manufacturing worker can produce a pair of Nike shoes better and cheaper, whereas a Texas farmer can grow sorghum and corn better and cheaper, the two sides exchange. Both sides become better and richer because of it. It's not as if China has always been winning and the U.S. has always been losing. Even by Trump's calculation and method, China had its own fair share of tough times. In 2009, when the financial crisis hit, the Western demand had been weakening. There are 200,000 Chinese manufacturing jobs, workers lost their jobs. So I was a reporter back in China back then. We visited factories, there were lots of jobs. But what the Chinese leadership told the Chinese workers back then was to retrain yourself, reskill yourself, to move up the value chain. That's what happened. That didn't result in a wave of nationalism, anti-West, anti-trade. No, that's not what's happening.
Yeah, in fact, he did say this is not a zero-sum game.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, let's bring in Robert Hormats. He's just across town from where we are, right here in New York. And Robert, watching this address in tone and in content, it was vastly different from the earlier address made by the United States President, Donald Trump, wasn't it?
Indeed it was. I think that the general tone of the speech itself and in general of State Councilor Wang Yi in the conversation I had with him and others did at the Council on Foreign Relations this morning was that China believed in playing a constructive international role, that China was going to take a leadership role in many areas of multilateralism, support for the UN, support for efforts to deal with climate change, helping to find solutions on the Korean Peninsula and in Iran and other places as well. And clearly, the message here is that if the U.S. pulls back from multilateral leadership, China will do what it believes it needs to do, which is to move more directly and more visibly to be a global leader in many, many areas. So this is really a juxtaposition of two attitudes toward globalization. The Chinese, which is supportive, and the U.S., which now Trump, but also American public opinion as well, is also much more reluctant to play that same global leadership role that the U.S. did for many decades. So this is really a potential turning point in global governance, and China and the U.S. may be moving in the opposite direction. How far from one another? How far this will go and what the details will be really remain to be worked out.
Robert, you say they're moving in opposite directions. What will it take to bring them together?
Well, that's really a good question. And I think that the U.S. has a history of benefiting enormously from its global leadership. It helped to build and create the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, and then the WTO, the United Nations, numerous alliances in the Atlantic and the Pacific, numerous other groups like the OECD. These have all been efforts by the United States both to project American influence, but also to do things which are beneficial to the world, with the knowledge that if the world prospers and is more stable, it'll be good for the United States. And I think the notion that we've seen over the last few days of drawing a distinction between being patriotic and supporting patriotism in the U.S. and supporting globalization really is a false dichotomy. The people who supported the development of global institutions, Harry Truman, President Roosevelt, General Marshall, and many presidents beyond that, Ronald Reagan, John Kennedy. These were patriotic people, but they were also people who understood that if America is going to play a constructive role and is going to be a major influence, a good influence, it's going to have to play a major role in the global system, which it has been doing and needs to continue to do, and recognize it's in America's interest to be a global leader.
All right, let's go to Sourabh Gupta. He's in our studio in Washington, D.C. Sourabh, the State Councilor Wang Yi, he said much about China's outreach to the world through its signature development project, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, other development projects as well. We heard it again, of course, on Friday in that address to the General Assembly. What did you make of the speech?
What I made of, particularly on the international development front, is that China, in some respects, has been a success story in terms of hauling a lot of people out of poverty and in being able to develop itself. And it would like to share some of those lessons of development, so long as those lessons are sought from developing countries. China positions itself, rightly so, I believe, still as a developing country, because its per capita income really is $10,000 or less, which really isn't that much, frankly. And so China understands the needs and the development requirements of many developing countries and is willing to share and be a participant in this, in this context. Obviously, there is a huge need for development financing, but also one needs to be careful when one does development, because development involves projects with long gestation periods. And we've had the issue with countries being uncertain about taking that much debt so early and wondering what the consequences would be, particularly if some of those projects don't come to fruition or do not meet their productivity potential. But that having been said, at this point of time, we need this. We need countries, advanced countries, and developing countries, and advanced developing countries to make this emphasis and commitment to development. And frankly, I'm actually heartened to know that U.S. Congress actually is thinking hard on these lines at this point of time on a bipartisan basis, particularly at a time when money is tight in Washington, D.C., to see how it can jump into the development game also internationally. So I think on this front, there's actually good news.
Robert Hormats, what is your feeling? Was it good news?
Well, that certainly was, and that certainly is. And if the U.S. is willing to play a more forthcoming global role in supporting infrastructure,
Right.
along with other countries, working with China, working with Japan, working with the EU and others, that's a very positive development. The problem is, A, getting the money, and B, getting the political support for it in an environment where we really haven't done as much from an infrastructure perspective in this country as we should. So I hope Congress goes along with it. I think it would be a good thing if a lot of countries help developing countries with infrastructure. I do think the point that was just made is a good one, and that is you have to make sure that these projects meet rigorous economic requirements. Otherwise, they're very difficult for these countries to pay off. And if they involve a lot of debt, that's a particular problem. So the selection of which projects are done and what the terms are is going to be very important. But I applaud constructive efforts to help infrastructure development by the U.S., by China, and by numerous other countries. The world needs it.
All right, let me bring it back here to our broadcast position at the United Nations, to Wang Guan. Wang Guan, on the issue of international trade, this is a big issue for China. China's been talking about this for a very long time. The United States has been imposing tariffs on China. There have been retaliatory tariffs imposed by China as well. We had some very tough words from State Councilor Wang Yi. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
No one should be allowed to place his own interest above the interests of others. Protectionism will only hurt oneself, and unilateral moves will bring damage to all. Regarding trade frictions, China stands for a proper settlement based on rules and consensus through dialogue and consultation on an equal footing. China will not be blackmailed or yield to pressure. China has taken steps not just to defend its own legitimate rights and interests. China is also acting to uphold the free trade system and international rules and order for the benefit of the global recovery and the common interests of all countries.
Here again, Wang Guan, if we compare this with the United States position, it couldn't be more different, could it?
Well, we heard from the State Councilor very firm but very principled rejection to what the U.S. has been proposing. Basically, China has been saying that trade has been benefiting everybody. State Councilor Wang really sends two messages. Number one, China is ready to talk if the United States wants to do it. But also China is ready to fight along if that's the choice of the White House. The president of China just toured some small businesses recently, telling them to stay strong, and the country will give them rebates and tax incentives for them to do what they do, but even better. And the premier, China's number two figure, just also talked to some private enterprises and telling them that they're going to streamline the tax structure so that they will become more competitive going forward. So China is ready to back up its talk, that is to, engage the U.S. in this war if that is the choice of the United States. China thinks that it has the capacity to do it, and China can still, reinvigorate its economy by boosting domestic demand.
Sourabh Gupta, clearly international trade a big priority for the Chinese. In that speech that we heard from the State Councilor, he told us very pointedly that China will not be blackmailed.
Oh, absolutely. It's very, very important. And we're talking not just international trade, but now international investment too, because China has become a big capital exporter to the world also. Yes, China will not be blackmailed. The point I would make, though, is that, and this is a point to the Trump administration I would direct it to, China used to run a huge current account surplus in the 2000s, and people were upset about it. And they talked to the Chinese, and the Chinese made that conscious effort. And now the current account surplus that the Chinese run it used to be 10% of GDP. It's down to 1% of GDP. It's very normal. So, I mean, they are a rules-bound player in the trading system, trading order. In terms of currency, again, latter part of 2000s, there was a feeling that the Chinese currency was hugely or substantially undervalued and that they were getting an export advantage from this, and people jumped on them. And what we had is internationalization of the RMB, and the RMB climbed up in value, appreciated to what the IMF said and says is fair value today. So you put pressure on them, China listens to you, it takes a little while. Now, there are grievances on technology transfer and investment in terms of the reciprocity, but don't just jump out here and have tariffs and have very harsh measures. give it time, speak with the Chinese, engage them, and you will see rampant liberalization of its investment environment, as has happened over the last 2 years, where the negative list has been pared down. And we can see that a lot of these problems today, which the US accuses China of, are amenable to resolution over the next 5 years as China itself liberalizes its joint venture requirements and its domestic investment-related requirements. So yes, the tools that are used are tools of blackmail at this point of time. And if one can move away from that, I think there is space for a very constructive dialogue on the economic issues, on trade and investment between the US and China.
All right, let's go back to Beijing, to Qinduo Xu. And Qinduo, another big issue for China, and we heard it again in the speech that the State Councilor made, and that is climate change and implementation of the Paris Accord. Let's listen to part of that.
To meet climate change is crucial to achieving sustainable development. China hopes to see negotiations on the implementation guidelines of the Paris Agreement to be concluded as scheduled by the end of this year to boost joint efforts for global ecological conservation.
Qinduo, what is your reading on the fact that the State Councilor felt it necessary to include mention of the Paris Accord and climate change in his address?
Well, I think, climate change is one of the priorities facing today's world. So by including this issue in his speech, I think Wang Yi is obviously stressing very much the importance of working together on multilateralism. China has been called to play a responsible role as a big country or stakeholder with the United States. And China is doing exactly that. As one of the largest emissioner of greenhouse gases, so China is playing its due role. If you compare China and the U.S., actually it's the U.S. now withdrawing from these efforts, international efforts, becoming the only country actually out of this Paris Agreement. So in this sense, I would say China is more progressive, looking at the solution, looking at the challenges, and also working together with other countries, seeking solutions to solve the problems facing not only to this generation, but the generations to come. I think in this sense, so it stresses very much multilateralism and the rules-based world order.
Wang Guan, what is your view on what the State Councilor had to say on climate change?
I think I feel very strongly about what he says. I'll give you one quick example. Last time when I was in China, I visited 6 Chinese cities in northern China that used to burn coal, and now they shifted to natural gas. And one consequence was that it does not produce enough energy, and people feel cold at home because the shift, the will to shift was so rapid. And then all the coal-fired power plants were asked to shift to natural gas to burn cleaner, more efficient energy. That is one direct observation.
Robert, I want to get to another issue right now. Well, we've seen over the past few months how the trade dispute between China and the United States has been escalating. Now President Trump appears to have doubled down, and to many, he said something that's inexplicable. He's been accusing China now of interfering in United States elections. This is the first time we've heard that. In fact, Trump says that China's retaliatory tariffs against the United States is tantamount to interference in its electoral process. What do you make of it?
Well, I have to tell you, I was quite surprised to hear that, too. It's the first time I'd heard it as well. First of all, one of the things that people in Washington cite is an advertisement by China Daily in the Des Moines Register, which is aimed at American farmers. And it's clear that one of the actions China has taken is to impose some retaliatory tariffs on American farm products. But other countries take, when you get into these kinds of trade disputes, other countries take measures against various sectors in the United States. Europe, for instance, has done this. So this should not be a surprise and is not unusual when you get into these tit-for-tat, retaliatory, escalation kind of situations.
Right.
They do have ramifications in other countries, but I think it's impossible to make the argument that is made in this country about Russia, that China is doing something covert and is interfering in American elections. This is an entirely different realm from the kind of Russian accusations that have been made. And
Right.
what China's doing is a normal kind of thing. When you get into trade wars, trade disputes, you take actions against various sectors in other countries. They have effects, but it's
Right.
not to influence, like the Russians are trying to do, the outcome of elections through all sorts of propaganda and things. China
Okay.
does not interfere in other countries' affairs as a matter of policy. For many decades, it has taken that policy and not done it.
Right. In fact, State Councilor Wang Yi made that specific point. I want to go to Qinduo Xu for this. Qinduo Xu, China did respond to these allegations that have come from President Trump. This is what Wang Yi had to say. He said this to the UN Security Council. Let's listen.
China has always adhered to the policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. It is a tradition of China's foreign policy, which has won widespread praise from the international community. We did not, do not, and will not interfere in the internal affairs of any country, and we don't accept any groundless accusations made against China.
So, Qinduo, what can China do to refute these allegations?
Well, just as the previous speaker, Robert, mentioned that, this is a part of the Chinese national policy, consistent policy in terms of foreign affairs, non-interference into international affairs of another country, internal affairs of another country. So China is very sensitive to that, interference in its own affairs, like Taiwan issue, Tibetan issue from other countries, in particular from the United States. So China is very cautious not to act in any way that to be seen as an interference in the internal affairs of another country, including that of the United States. Look, if you look at the trade war, not only between China and the US, but also between US, Mexico, US, Canada, and the European Union, you will see, I think it's Mexico and the European Union, they are imposing basically retaliatory sanctions, tariffs on this cheese, products, and also Harley Davidson in Wisconsin, because that's the home of the House Speaker, Paul Ryan. So people will they think this is not right. We should sit down and negotiate. So people are fighting against a trade war by President Trump. So they will do what they do. So it's not only China, but also other countries doing something. They are basically saying a signal that, we don't want to have a trade fight here.
Right. Okay, Wang Guan, I've got a few seconds left. This almost bizarre comment from President Trump that China is interfering in American elections. Is this about domestic politics? Is this about the fact that there's a midterm election coming up?
Even Brookins said that should the Republicans lose the House or even the Senate, Trump can say that, look, it was a Chinese interference.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for. You can see all of our special coverage from the UN online at our website. That's at america.cgtn.com. I'm Arlen Naidu in New York. Thanks for being with us.